Hi, this is Melanie Conroy, and I'm going to be talking about metrics for French literary history and some of the metrics that I'm using to classify writers in terms of productivity and how prolific they are. And I'd love to hear some feedback from other people who are doing similar things. So just by way of introduction, I am the co-director with Chloe Edmondson of the Salons Project, and we're looking a lot at the social networks of writers. I also study academic networks as well as salon networks. And so here you see for all of the 10,000 writers that I was able to locate through 18th and 19th century France, these are the birth and death places, and you can see the timeline of birth years. So this is a very large project, and it's something that's very much still in progress. But where it really started was with the idea of studying different literary networks. So here you see mostly 19th century salons hosted by women, and you can see both the timeline and where they're located in Paris. Here are similar kinds of literary circles led by men. And again, you see a timeline and the map of Paris with the size of the circle indicating how many people attended each society or salon. So the interest in metrics for me was to come up with a kind of quick and dirty way to be able to weight the productivity of the writers, and also potentially some of their influence, the extent to which their writings are interesting to a global audience or potentially canonical. And so I very early on started using VIAF. And of course, I'm sure a lot of you have used VIAF, and there's a lot of criticisms of it, which I'll get to later. But it's a really good way to reconcile different name forms. So here I'm using the example of Voltaire. And obviously there's many people who have Voltaire in their name, and there's also, Voltaire, you can also use his real name. And so if you see the list of names that are associated with Voltaire, some of them are relatively minor, but this is the kind of thing that, computers still struggle with reconciling. And so some of the metrics that are available already without any kind of modification are things like the number of entries. So Voltaire, for example, has 159 VIAF entries. These are imperfect, but it's a good place to get started. VIAF countries, so the countries and regions of publication. Again, we can see some gaps in places like Africa, but it's a very good place to begin in terms of seeing where the works have been interesting to different readers. And finally, ISBN by decade gives at least a quick idea of how interesting the writer was to at least scholars and students at various times in literary history, such that new editions were being produced for a new audience. So there's multiple problems with VIAF, multiple records for the same person. So even though it's supposed to reconcile all of the Voltaires, sometimes you still have two of them. Many writers don't have VIAF numbers yet, and so they won't be found in the database. Duplicates, some countries' libraries aren't represented, and then, of course, there's always books in libraries that haven't been digitally cataloged at all. So my solution for this is to use sets of writers or members of literary circles. So instead of a really rigorous ranking that's going to say, oh, he has 169 works, we're going to be grouping together writers who have a similar number of, we don't necessarily need to be making really granular distinctions. And of course, it's always important to keep track of writers in regions that don't appear in the data. So just because a country isn't appearing in the data doesn't mean that, it didn't have any writers. Their library might just not be participating. And then I think it's also important to look at the writers who don't have VIAF numbers and think about what they might have in common. So whether that's genres, gender, publishers, social status, maybe worker poets aren't really represented to the extent that they should be. So the first step for me was creating sets. So I have writers of all kinds. So those are authors of textual works that are resolved with historical figures. So it's a writer where I have the pseudonym and I was able to match that with an existing writer. And only a fraction of those are going to have VIAF numbers. Again, I think it's interesting to look at who does and does not get a VIAF number. Prolific writers, so people with 40 or more entries. Current writers, if they have new editions. Global writers, so writers who have at least editions in at least 25 countries. And then a lot of the others are genre, so literary writers, novelists, poets, playwrights, translators, journalists, and then women, who are very important to 18th and 19th century studies because their social status was so different from men. So very quickly, the data that I do have, so from approximately 10,000 pseudonyms or names identified with authors of books, I was able to identify 7,285 writers, historical people, so clearly not all of them. And then the people with the VIAF was already less than half. So yeah, not everybody has a VIAF. And then you see that, prolific and global, well, those are more restrictive categories, so it's natural that there would be fewer members in there. And then 577 women, which, thanks to the Regions Project and a few others, have done really good work retrieving those names. And so you can see that data in another chart that's slightly zoomed in. And you see that there's a similar sort of pattern with usually approximately, a third to half having a VIAF number, and then a much smaller number of prolific and global writers. And still a percentage of women within all the different genres. So women are publishing in these different genres. So preliminary conclusions, again, I wasn't able to identify everybody, but of the people I was able to identify, the long tail or the one-hit wonders, people who had only one hit in the database, were disproportionately journalists, poets, and correspondents, so people who had one letter with, say, Voltaire. Global writers, people who had works that appeared in the library catalogs of at least 25 countries, were mostly literary, and they're more likely to be novelists and playwrights than poets. The women that I did manage to identify were likely to be poets or novelists rather than playwrights. And the genres that women could publish in tended to be more poetry and novels and less so playwright. So it appears that there may be a correlation between the genres that women were able to publish in and the ones that brought global success. Thank you again. So my two websites, melanieconroy.org and salonsproject.org, have a bit more information. And if anyone else is working on a similar topic or has other metrics aside from this idea of using sets on the VIAF data, I would love to hear them at Melanie Conroy, mrconroy@memphis.edu.